Hi, and welcome back. Cable guys have added a new effect to their ShaperBox plugin, so let's take a look at ReverbShaper. I'll start simple with this drum loop, load a ShaperBox, then add a ReverbShaper. And we now have the default hall reverb setting over the whole loop. First thing I'll do is grab that send slider, which controls the input level to the reverb, and pull it all the way down, because I actually only want to add reverb to the snare. It's a 1 bar loop, and the modulation defaults to 1 bar in length, so we don't need to change anything here, and we can already see a representation of the audio behind our modulation curve. Let's select the line tool and turn on snapping, and turn up the send level briefly for each snare hit. Now we can pick a more appropriate reverb type, and we have lots of options. Some of you may already have clocked that this is a convolution reverb, and these are IRs that we're browsing. I'll talk more about the implications of that in a moment. First, let's talk more about this modulation I've set up. In itself, this is not massively revolutionary. It's equivalent to automating the send level to an all-wet reverb effect set up in a send-return configuration, and it's been possible for a long time. Doing it in ShaperBox might be more convenient when it's a repeating loop like this, but if you're just flying in a spot effect for one part of the song, it's probably still more efficient to use automation. The main advantage to doing it this way, in my opinion, is that you don't need a separate send channel, and it's easy to process the combined result with more plugins, or perhaps more ShaperBox modules, like the Time Shaper, for example, which can now rearrange, repitch, or even reverse those reverb tails we added. I've covered Time Shaper before, however, and this video is supposed to be about ReverbShaper, so I won't let myself get distracted. Let's drop in some fat DMX drums, playing a head noddy halftime beat, and this time I'm going to set up ReverbShaper as a send effect. Click the little send button when you load it, and the reverb will be already set all wet for you. And let's send from the snare channel. If I click to show the list of reverb types, you'll notice that they're organised into categories, so it's easy to find the small rooms or the weird metallic options. Or the smooth, lingering tails. But we actually have quite a few options to tweak these impulses, which you may not have in your regular IR loader. Like the decay time, for example. This applies an envelope to the impulse, fading it out faster and shortening the decay time accordingly. You can see a graphic representation of this over to the left. And this on its own already makes it much easier to fit an impulse to your mix, as you don't have to load one that's exactly the right length. Just find one with the right colour, and if it's too long, you can tweak it accordingly. More surprisingly, however, we also get a size parameter. How do they manage that with an impulse? The explanatory text at the bottom of the interface describes this as resampling the impulse, which is doubtless technically correct. But I think it's more intuitive to think of the impulse as a sample, and the size parameter is a pitch control. Tune the impulse higher to get a smaller room with a shorter decay, or lower for a bigger, longer room. This is easier to hear if I pick one of the more colourful metallic types with strong resonances. Listen to those resonances shift up or down as I change the size. Anyway, what I'm actually after in this case is a classic gated reverb effect. And there are actually 2, maybe 2.5 different ways to achieve this. First of all, we could simply pick one of the gated reverb types provided. These are impulses that stop relatively suddenly, rather than decaying exponentially like a normal room. So the gating is burnt into the reverb itself, and you can adjust the size to control how long that burst of reverb lasts. One of these might be just the ticket, but if not, we have other options. I'll pick a nice big smooth sounding impulse, then switch the decay parameter to gated instead, and set an appropriate length with the slider. This is actually fundamentally the same approach as the first method. We're shortening the impulse to make the reverb stop suddenly, rather than muting it with a gate in the traditional way. That's actually a really important difference, which I'll come back to later on. But in the context of a snare drum that needs a powerful gated reverb, shortening the impulse is very much equivalent to the traditional noise gate method. You may notice, however, that this gate that's not a gate closes quite softly. And we can see on the waveform display that there's still a short envelope applied, rather than a hard stop. So let's turn the gated option off, reset the decay, and look at ReverbShaper's unconventional approach to the conventional method. I'll click the volume slider to make sure we're seeing the reverb output level modulation below, then switch it to audio triggering instead of sync. Now the modulation is re-triggered for every snare hit. There are triggering settings available if you need them. You can adjust the threshold for triggering. Note that these are transients that we're triggering from, not just peak levels. We can adjust transient sensitivity with the detail slider, switch between 3 different detection modes, filter the sidechain signal, or even switch to the external sidechain. But I don't need to change anything with just a simple snare drum input. The default settings work fine. So let's set up some modulation. This is easier with snap turned on, so I can double click to add a final node exactly at the end and exactly at 0. Then I'll drag the line to add a curvy node and make that stop more sudden. And now let's tweak the timing. Half a bar is too long. A quarter, still a bit too bombastic. But an eighth note is just right to add a sense of power without getting in the way too much. If I right-click or shift-click, I can make that curve tighter, and I can tailor the exact shape of the gating much more easily than you can with a conventional noise gate. Let's lower the initial level and maybe make that recovery curvier. And now the reverb fades in before stopping dead, as if it's being squashed by a compressor as well. This is a cool sound, in my opinion, and useful for a lot more than just 80s tribute acts. Now let's introduce an FM synth bass part, and talk about why those 2 different methods of creating a gated reverb are so fundamentally different. If I stick a huge reverb on this part, it gets a bit messy, right? If I gated that reverb in the conventional manner, the reverb would build up and get messy in exactly the same way until the last note ended and the gate closed. Now let's try shortening the impulse instead. Now the reverb added to the first note stops dead before the last note starts. The reverb ends after the specified time, regardless of whether there's still a note playing or not. This is useful in much the same way as normal gated reverb. You can have a huge sounding reverb that still gets out of the way quickly to avoid cluttering up the mix. But you can do this with any parts, not just drums that can be meaningfully gated. While we're in sound design territory, note that multiband processing comes as standard in ShaperBox. We have 2 bands by default, but the lowest is set to no reverb, and the crossover slope is set to 6 dB. So in effect, this is just a gentle high-pass filter for the input signal. If anyone is thinking that a filter for the output would be more useful, remember that convolution is linear, and so are these crossover filters, which means the order in which they run literally makes no difference at all. Anyway, I'll stick with this for the low band, as reverb is rarely useful down that low. But let's drag the high crossover down, and maybe make it steeper. And now I can pick a different reverb for the high frequencies. Or tune the size differently for the higher frequencies. Or set different hold times for our gate that's not a gate. Okay, let's talk about what convolution reverbs are particularly good at. Most obviously, recreating the sound of a real room. Here's a strings part that I made from multi-samples. And here it is again, with a nice hall-type reverb. That's much better, right? Convolution reverbs are also good for creating very smooth, dense reverbs, like these in the smooth category. These are perfect for one of my favourite ear candy tricks. Let's select the volume parameter, then I'll pick the line tool with snapping enabled and make a trance-gate. This is great, but it does risk smearing that strings part somewhat. So let's add some ducking from the dynamics section. I'll make this pretty extreme, with quite a slow release, so the reverb trance-gate effect is ducked out of the way while the part plays, then fades back in afterwards. Being good at recreating real rooms means convolution reverbs are also good at small room settings, which are usually much more important in a mixing context than the big cathedrals and such like. Here's a synth part, which I've spiced up with a couple of other ShaperBox modules. Most importantly, a volume shaper to create the rhythmic pumping. I don't want to smear that effect with a big long reverb, but I do want it to sit in the mix without sounding stuck on top. So let's try this diffuse room IR from the small rooms section. And that's just the ticket. Okay, final point. You can import your own impulses. You'll need to open the user reverbs folder, which you can do from the drop-down menu in the plugin. Then copy them over, and they'll immediately be available in the user section of the Reverb browser. This is a bright and glossy church wall that I grabbed years ago when recording a choir on location. But this guitar part is also running through another ReverbShaper, which isn't actually doing reverb at all, because the other thing that IRs are really good at is capturing the sound of a guitar speaker cabinet. Here's how this guitar sounds without it. Obviously, you'll need to set the mix slider fully wet if you're doing this. And if you're playing through it live, you might want to get rid of the 16 samples of latency reserved for DriveShaper. The plugin is now 0 latency, which is perfect. There are a couple of good reasons you might want to use ReverbShaper for this instead of your usual IR loader. First of all, that size parameter is profound. The speaker and cabinet resonances all shift up or down in frequency. When even a small change here can result in a dramatically different guitar sound. The other reason is those multiband options again. You can pick an impulse with the ideal low-end chugginess, then use that for just the low end. Pick one with the perfect mid-range growl and use that for just the mid-range. And blend in the high frequencies from yet another. Combined with the size parameters, the possibilities are endless. Of course, when running a multiband setting, the band gain controls become a kind of EQ. But also, when running guitar cab impulses rather than reverbs, the ducking options we looked at earlier just become simple compression. Or rather, multiband compression in this case, which I probably shouldn't call simple. Let's squash the low frequency chuggy part of the sound with a relatively slow attack. And obviously, I'm going to need to track this part twice and pan them. That's all for now. You can buy ReverbShaper on its own or in a bundle with the other ShaperBox modules. Check the website for pricing. Depending when you watch this, there may be a Black Friday sale running. So thanks to Cable Guys for sponsoring another video, and thanks to you all for watching.